Episode 3, Iron, Chains. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, for the last part of 17th century iron, we need to take a dive into how iron was used to add muscle power to the development of American food. And it will take a detour through war and commercial technology. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. When it comes to human technology, food and war both receive lots of attention. And throughout time, food, the ability to hunt for, grow, sell, and transport food, has been a proximate cause for lots of war. The tight connection of iron, war, technology, and food, and then Europe, West Africa, and the east sides of North and South America all come together in world-altering ways in the 17th century. But it didn't start in the 17th century. Of course it didn't. A good place to start is my high school history teacher's favorite historical attractor, Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry was like the Elon Musk of the 15th century. He had a lot of ideas, lots of money, access to power, a tendency to take all the credit because he was the prince, and a serious first-mover advantage. This Prince of Portugal, with a workshop full of naval architects, mathematicians, astronomers, and natural philosophers, built a better boat with a roomier and faster hull and a better sail, a lateen sail that could sail across and closer to the wind. This late medieval lab also built astrolabes and compasses that were practical for shipboard use. Next thing you know, Portugal had the premier navigational tools in the best boat for ocean exploring in all of Europe and was getting very rich from its exploration and trading ventures to the west coast of Africa. This was unmapped by Europeans then, and they eventually made it to India. They also thoroughly documented the seasons and directions of prevailing winds that allowed ships to develop the circle route to get back and forth across the Atlantic more dependably. While this was happening, cane sugar and then sugar islands became the big ideas in the Iberian Peninsula, and then across Europe. By the 16th century, one of the more lucrative trading ventures the Portuguese developed was bringing slaves from West Africa to Portugal. And with the sugar trade expanding like crazy, African slaves were sent to the sugar islands on the east side of the Atlantic that the Portuguese had set up. And one of the major currencies used in this trade for human labor was iron. While there was a long-standing tradition by seagoing peoples the world over of raiding shore villages for captives, and there were some captains working under the Portuguese flag who joined the local Barbary pirates in these activities, this was not the major source of slaves. Raiding is a chancy business with mixed results, and the Portuguese wanted to be traders, not raiders. They established slave markets along the West African coast, starting at the bottom of that big bump and moving east. The Gold Coast was a favorite early stop. They were drawn there because gold was readily used as exchange for cloth, tobacco, glass, and spices. The Portuguese and the West Africans developed a lively and sophisticated trade network. The tastes and standards of the West African merchants were no less particular than the European and Arab traders they dealt with. In fact, the Portuguese and Dutch captains and merchants made note of the superior steel spears the West Africans had. And here's why the West African warriors had better spears. The Iron Age in sub-Saharan Africa, think everything in the lump running all the way back to the Bight, or more precisely, Senegambia to Biafra, was pretty similar in development to what was going on in Northern Europe up until about the late 13th century. Both had access to plenty of iron ore, and both had similar pottery technologies, thus heat technologies. Then the split happened. Northern Europe added efficiencies by harnessing water power to drive mechanical bellows, which allowed them to speed smelt iron from the ore. West Africa, north of the equator, had fewer people and much less water in handy continuous streams, so they developed chimney technology. Furnaces that were much taller created a passive forced air technology. Quote, making the Sahel the Manhattan of African metallurgy, with natural draft furnaces that might be 4 meters high. That's about 13 feet. This was a slower technology, but allowed carbon to more thoroughly infuse the iron, which created an early carbon steel that was harder, more flexible, and sharpened much better than the softer and more brittle wrought iron Europeans were making with their bellows-powered mills. But the higher quality African metal took about 8 times longer to make. All of this and much more detail comes from a fascinating paper on voyage iron by Chris Evans and Goran Raiden. Anyway, this leap in weapons technology led to the rise of different African empires due in part to some wide leads in the arms race. The one that concerns us is the Songhai Empire, which covered the Sahel area and then also stretched up towards Morocco. It hit its peak in the mid-16th century and had collapsed by the end of that same century. As the Songhai Empire collapsed, instability increased, war spread, and there were suddenly lots of prisoners of war. So what does this have to do with the slave trade in 17th century colonial America? Lots, it turns out. Many early colonists were bent on making money, because that's what 17th century European colonies were for. And lots of agricultural muscle was required. But it wasn't that the colonists woke up one day and said, "Growing our own exports, that's very hard. I know what to do. Slavery." No. In order to understand how slavery began to inhabit the 17th century British Atlantic, I think it is important to set the scene for what slavery was to the people living then. How was it incorporated into their daily life? While this is a difficult and depressing and frustrating topic to look at, I really believe that getting into the colonist mindset helps us understand how a society got from point A to B to K all the way to point Z. In the memory of those 17th century Western Europeans setting up shop on the American side of the Atlantic, there was a definite knowledge of slaves. Slavery in Western Europe, north of the Pyrenees, that's the mountain range that separates France from Spain, from the 15th to the 17th century had its own flavor. Rarely were people formal slaves, solemnized with wax-sealed parchments or something. Instead, they were often unpaid servants with no ability to change anything about their life. Institutionalized slavery of Christians had been outlawed by the Roman Church. But there would be informal situations where people would be just unpaid servants. So who fell into this class of unpaid/unfree servant? They could be prisoners, debtors, unsuccessful farmers, and very often they were orphans and prisoners of war. Europe fought a lot of wars, many conflicts dragging on for years. 10 Years' War, 30 Years' War, 100 Years' War. The English Civil War was actually 3 wars over about a decade. And these had a tendency to create lots of prisoners of war and orphans, partly through straightforward death in war, but more usually due to the starvation and disease connected to the disruption of agriculture. Both of these classes of people had absolutely no rights in the societies where they would find themselves. Often they would end up as muscle owned by other people. While this did provide food, shelter, and someone who could offer some very, very basic protections, it really offered nothing beyond that and offered no way to better the situation. In war, if you were a noble, your side or family could ransom you. That is, you could get bought back. It was a way for people fighting wars to make money, or at least pay for supplies and soldiers. But the common soldiers, as in most of the people, would not have ransoms. And if their side lost and was out of money to get the little people home, there was a good chance these common soldiers could get tossed into the local prisoner labor pool. Using POWs as agricultural labor is something that happens on and off. German POWs were even used as ag labor during World War II. I'll get into those intriguing details way, way in the future. Using regular domestic criminal prisoners as ag labor is pretty common, even right now, and are part of how farms kept going during the pandemic. and they are paid, sorta, but that's not where we're going right now. But the closer a soldier was to home, the more likely it was that he'd escape. And collecting war ransoms was always a tricky enterprise, especially if it was lots of money. And if there were just too many ex-soldiers, they might run off and create a bandit gang or a mercenary band. So there was nothing stable or certain about POW labor. Back to the Portuguese. Here they are in 16th century West Africa. Here's a bunch of extra POWs, and here's these Portuguese traders buying people for labor. And they were very familiar with the practice of making servants or slaves, depending on their religion, of POWs. For the West African warlords, this was a much easier way to get value out of POWs. Sell them outright. Along with cloth, copper, brass, rum, tobacco, and glass, the Portuguese were bringing bars of refined iron. It might be inferior, that is softer than the local product, but it was a safer bet to sell a prisoner of war for a bar of iron than to get the agricultural or foundry work out of him to produce it. This became such a regular trade, the Portuguese set up trading islands where they warehoused trade goods and kept prisoners before they were shipped. Local blacksmiths were hired to work iron into shackles and chains. This worked because the technological levels of the West African blacksmiths when it came to working bar iron was equal to their European counterparts. Thus, the Portuguese, Dutch, and then French and English companies would ship in bar iron that could be used as a currency or worked as needed on the spot. And much of this bar iron was from Sweden. Yep, Sweden. Because the Swedes could be depended on to make the bars of high enough quality and in the correct sizes. The West African iron buyer was exacting. This was truly a global trade. Quick sidebar. When reading about West African blacksmithing from the Middle Ages to the 17th century, the magical and ceremonial aspects are brought into the conversation, which is real and important. But there is a tendency to assume that European metallurgy of the same period was rational and scientific. It was not. It tended to be less hereditary than it was in the Sahel and separate from the dominant religious dogma, that is, the Catholic Church. But metalworking in Europe was just as tied up in mystery, mythology, and secrecy as it was in West Africa. Alchemy and all its mystical and quasi-religious tangles ruled the day. Even Robert Boyle, in the 17th century, often credited as the father of modern chemistry, thought of himself as a natural philosopher and was steeped in the contemporary Hermetic alchemical literature. Where are we? At the end of the 16th century. With advancements in iron weapons technology overlapping with Portuguese sailing advancements and sugar islands opening up on the American side of the Atlantic, the demand for slave labor exploded. A financial incentive was now in place to keep war going to supply prisoners to the Portuguese. Local warlords had a place to ship off enemies, where they would literally never be seen again, for a profit. And why not be sure to send away the smartest, the most energetic, and the young whippersnappers with the wild, innovative ideas most likely to destabilize your grip on power? And what had been, in both Europe and Africa, a fairly local and small-time trade in humans as purchased labor in the 15th and 16th centuries suddenly exploded into an ocean-spanning multi-continent industry. And Pope Nicholas V had said, as long as they aren't Christians, it was okay. Now we are in 17th century Europe. The political movers and shakers getting all hyped up on caffeine and tobacco to fuel late-night salons and are writing like crazy. Sea captains with a self-promotional bent are talking up this new world place, while the fishing fleets are waving their hands going, shh, darn it. Europe starts cranking out these new paper books on this burgeoning invention, the printing press. The Reformation is going gangbusters. And Europe is spinning up an industrial-scale labor and brain drain of the African continent for the purposes of building agricultural fortunes. This meant the Atlantic offered two very different fates depending on your starting point. For white Europeans, the American colonies in the 17th century was where you went if you were a troublemaker or if you had crazy ideas. You could build something. You might succeed. You might not. But if you did, you could come back to Europe or write a pamphlet and totally show off. But if you were from West Africa, you could also be sent across the Atlantic if you were a troublesome sort or likely looking. You might also build something, but it was definitely not yours. At best, it might be recorded that your owner got credit for your work. But you could never go home and you'd never get to show off. Unfree servants, prisoner labor, and indentured servitude were all part of the landscape of the average 17th century European. When the first Africans were dropped off in Virginia by some Dutch traders in 1619, the surprised colonists purchased them, but largely assigned them to the category of indentured servants, who could work off the debt, and some did. The 17th century colonies contained a hodgepodge of people doing labor for others. Some had voluntarily signed over their freedom for a passage to the New World, and some had been outright kidnapped and or purchased. Initially, both groups of people had some chance of working off their debt, but some had been purchased for life, along with all of their descendants. Different colonies adopted different policies. As the 17th century progressed, laws and customs started to sort themselves out, and if you arrived on a boat and were not white, the likelihood that your contract was forever became more likely, and finally, certain. As more and more people were shipped to these colonial shores, a certain banality drifted in. Even though each experience of each person kidnapped and sold from their home across the sea to a far shore had a uniquely terrifying experience, the colonists allowed all these individuals to fuzz together into a sort of them. Somewhere in the 17th century, for the colonists on the western shores of the Atlantic, America's East Coast, and Caribbean, hundreds of thousands of people with distinct histories, languages, and traditions were flattened out into simply Negroes. They went from being people to an industry, part of the commodity export plans for making money on tobacco, sugar, molasses, rum, rice, and timber products. They were recorded in account books along with the exports of fish, salt, deer hides, and Native Americans. Wait, what? Colonists were importing people from West Africa while exporting people from America? Remember how I said that it is much harder to enslave people close to home? Yeah, well, there was a somewhat regular practice of enslaving Native Americans because local money was not considered good by many ship captains and merchants, and many of the early commodities produced in the colonies were not high value. As a 17th century British politician, Pollexfen, said, "The original of movable wealth is labor." First, this was done with Caribbean people, but they were rapidly wiped out. Locals from Virginia to Maine were routinely captured or tricked onto boats as part of trading exchanges, kidnapped and shipped to either the Caribbean or Europe. Just as the soil of the East Coast was mined with iron tools, the original population was mined for wealth with chains. Ever since Pope Nicholas V had made it clear to the Portuguese in the 15th century that slavery was okay if they weren't Christians, the Age of Discovery had created all sorts of opportunities for ship owners, captains, and traders to encounter all sorts of new kinds of non-Christians. And if what these non-Christians were trading didn't seem worth it, well, a little kidnappery might make the whole voyage adequately profitable. Does this sound crazy? It sounds crazy to me, but it gets even crazier. Here we are in the early 17th century. Africans are being shipped to the Caribbean for the sugar trade. Native North Americans and South Americans are getting shipped everywhere for labor and or novelty. In 1614, up in the later-to-be Rhode Island area, a certain Captain Thomas Hunt hosted a group of Peconiket Confederation hunters to trade for some nice beaver pelts that the hunters had. Deciding that wasn't enough for him, Captain Hunt went for the trade and kidnapping option and sailed off to the slave market in Malaga, Spain, which is not that far inside Gibraltar on the south coast of Spain. Well, these kidnappees are in pretty bad shape by the time they stagger off the boat into the Spanish sun. But they are sold and then taken in by a local monastery to civilize them. Make them Christians. One of these guys, a certain Tisquantum from the Patuxet tribe, impressed the monks. He was subsequently released and somehow made his way to London. There he would reside for a time with one John Slaney in Mr. Slaney's residence on Cornhill, which you can still find about a kilometer north of London Bridge and 2 kilometers east of St. Paul's Cathedral. At that point, it would have been Old St. Paul's, because that didn't burn down until 1660. Anyway, Mr. Slaney happened to be a merchant and the treasurer of the Newfoundland Company, which had fishing interests in those rich fishing banks off the shore of future Canada. And when the fishermen went on shore to dry their catch, more on this when we get to fish, they could certainly use a translator and just someone who knew stuff about the northeast coast of the New World. So Mr. Slaney sends this guy, now generally known as Squanto, from London on a fishing boat out to Newfoundland. There he hooks up with a Captain Thomas Dermer, who has a copy of this John Smith guy's map of the New England coast. Yeah, I'm talking about the Pocahontas guy. So Captain Dermer says, "Hey, would you be willing to be my guide as I explore this New England place?" So Squanto says, "Sure, as long as when I get home I can stay there." Dermer says, "Okay, let's go." I'm paraphrasing, of course. I don't have a transcript. So in 1619, after the English fishing fleet heads home, leaving their fishing camp empty, Squanto and Dermer head south. Yep. Before meeting the Pilgrims, Squanto first was kidnapped, enslaved, sent to Spain, then England, then caught a ride on a fishing boat to Newfoundland. To find out what happens next, you'll have to return for my series on corn, which is coming right after sugar. So it's time to wrap up 17th century iron, where we've looked at how American food owes much of its starting shape to the way iron was incorporated into the colonial culture that landed here from Europe. The tools colonists used to farm, to cook, and to procure food directly shaped the food America started on, and are the part of the story we are used to seeing. But colonists also used iron in weapons to take food and used iron as currency and chains to enslave people, who were then used as trade goods or agricultural labor. This is the part of the story we usually don't see. But this has left marks and shadows all over American food culture. These left-out parts are even more important to uncover and know if we really want to understand the history of American food. So I hope you will join me next week when we look at sugar and how the fact that the international sugar industry, which is older than America, is actually a big reason America even happened. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Again, that's thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with any promised pictures and links, I'll always include any interesting books I read for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show description.